Picture this. It's March 24th, 1603, and the greatest monarch England has ever known draws her final breath. Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen who defeated the Spanish Armada and ushered in a golden age of literature, exploration, and prosperity, lies dying at Richmond Palace. As her lifeless hand drops the ring of state, a question that had haunted England for decades finally demanded an answer. Who would dare follow the woman who had made England the envy of Europe? The answer would shock a nation to its core. Enter James VI of Scotland, soon to become James I of England, a man whose reign would be so scandalous, so controversial, and so utterly different from his predecessor that it would leave the English wondering if they had traded their golden age for a fool's paradise. This is the story of how one king's outrageous behavior, shocking personal life, and catastrophic political decisions nearly destroyed everything Elizabeth had built. But James's story begins long before he set foot on English soil, in the blood-soaked courts of Scotland where survival meant mastering the deadly game of politics before most children learned to read. To understand the scandal that James would bring to England, we must first journey north to Scotland, where a baby king's traumatic childhood would shape the man who would shock a nation. James Charles Stuart entered the world on June 19, 1566, but his birth was overshadowed by a murder so brutal it would define Scottish politics for generations. Just months before James's birth, his father, the handsome but weak Lord Darnley, had participated in the savage murder of David Rizzio, his pregnant wife Mary, Queen of Scots' Italian secretary and rumored lover. Picture the scene. A terrified pregnant queen, 7 months with child, forced to watch as armed men dragged her companion from her private chambers and stabbed him 56 times just outside her door. The blood reportedly seeped under the door as Mary, clutching her unborn child, listened to Rizzio's dying screams. This was the world James was born into, a realm where political disagreements were settled with daggers, where mothers could be murderers, and where even royal blood offered no protection from betrayal. When James was barely 8 months old, his father Lord Darnley was found dead in mysterious circumstances. His house had been blown up with gunpowder, but strangely, Darnley's body showed no signs of fire or explosion damage. Instead, he appeared to have been strangled, a detail that pointed to assassination rather than accident. The prime suspect? His own wife, Mary, Queen of Scots, who had grown to despise her husband's weakness and suspected infidelities. But the scandal was just beginning. Within months of Darnley's death, Mary married the Earl of Bothwell, the very man most suspected of orchestrating her husband's murder. The Scottish nobles, already suspicious of their Catholic queen's judgment, erupted in rebellion. They forced Mary to abdicate when James was just 13 months old, making him the youngest king in Scottish history. As if losing both parents before his second birthday wasn't traumatic enough, James's childhood was marked by a succession of brutal tutors and guardians who seemed determined to break his spirit. George Buchanan, his primary tutor, was a sadistic scholar who beat the young king mercilessly while filling his head with radical Protestant theology and tales of how evil Catholic monarchs deserved to be overthrown by their subjects. Under Buchanan's cruel tutelage, James developed a stutter that would plague him throughout his life, particularly when he was nervous or angry. More significantly, he developed an intense fear of violence and bloodshed that would later manifest in his obsessive pursuit of peace, even when war might have been the wiser choice. The young king also witnessed horrors that would have broken most children. When he was 12, his beloved guardian, the Earl of Morton, was executed by the Maiden, a Scottish version of the guillotine. James was forced to watch as the man who had been like a father to him was beheaded for his alleged role in Lord Darnley's murder. The sight of blood spurting from Morton's severed neck reportedly made the young king vomit and gave him a lifelong phobia of sharp weapons. But perhaps most significantly for his future reign in England, James's Scottish childhood taught him that he could trust no one completely. Nobles who smiled at court might be plotting rebellion in their castles. Advisors who swore loyalty might be accepting bribes from foreign powers. Even family members could be murderers. This paranoia would later manifest in James's obsessive belief in his divine right to rule. If he couldn't trust his subjects, he would rely on God's mandate instead. It also explains his later fascination with male favorites who owed their entire position to his personal favor rather than inherited noble status. By the time James reached adulthood, he had survived more political intrigue, violence, and betrayal than most monarchs faced in entire lifetimes. He had learned to navigate the treacherous waters of Scottish politics through cunning, compromise, and an almost supernatural ability to sense which way the political winds were blowing. But Scotland was a small, poor kingdom on the periphery of European power. England was the prize, wealthy, influential, and desperately in need of an heir after Elizabeth's long, childless reign. James had spent decades positioning himself as Elizabeth's successor, carefully maintaining his Protestant credentials while secretly negotiating with Catholic powers, keeping his options open until the moment Elizabeth breathed her last. What he couldn't have anticipated was how his Scottish methods and mannerisms would be received by the proud, prosperous English, who had grown accustomed to their Virgin Queen's dignity, intelligence, and unwavering dedication to their interests above all others. When James I first set foot on English soil in April 1603, the contrast couldn't have been more stark. Where Elizabeth had maintained a court renowned throughout Europe for its elegance, sophistication, and cultural achievements, James brought with him a raucous band of Scottish nobles whose idea of courtly entertainment involved drinking contests, crude jokes, and behavior that shocked even the most worldly English courtiers. The English had expected their new king to gradually adapt to their customs and traditions. Instead, James seemed determined to transform England into a northern extension of his Scottish kingdom. Within weeks of his arrival, Whitehall Palace had been invaded by what one English observer described as a horde of beggarly Scots, who spoke in incomprehensible accents, wore unfashionable clothes, and displayed table manners that would have embarrassed peasants. The culture clash was immediate and brutal. English courtiers who had spent decades perfecting the subtle art of Elizabethan court politics suddenly found themselves competing with Scottish favorites who had earned their positions through entirely different criteria. Where Elizabeth had valued intelligence, wit, and service to the crown, James seemed more interested in handsome young men who could entertain him with hunting stories and crude humor. The English nobility watched in horror as their new king showered wealth and titles upon Scottish newcomers while treating longtime English servants of the crown with casual indifference. Sir Robert Cecil, Elizabeth's brilliant and loyal secretary, found himself increasingly sidelined as James relied more heavily on his Scottish advisors who understood his moods and preferences. But it wasn't just the Scottish invasion that shocked English sensibilities. It was James himself. Where Elizabeth had been a master of public relations, carefully crafting her image as the Virgin Queen who lived only for her subjects' welfare, James seemed almost allergic to public appearances. He avoided crowds, rarely showed himself to his subjects, and when he did appear in public, his behavior often scandalized onlookers. Contemporary accounts describe a king who couldn't sit still during formal ceremonies, who would scratch himself inappropriately, who spoke with a thick Scottish accent peppered with crude expressions, and who seemed more interested in his dogs than in the dignitaries he was supposed to be impressing. Where Elizabeth had been graceful and regal in every public moment, James appeared awkward, fidgety, and frequently inappropriate. The stark differences extended to their approaches to royal spending. Elizabeth, despite her love of luxury, had been relatively frugal with public money, understanding that her subjects' prosperity ultimately funded her own. James, coming from the impoverished Scottish court, was dazzled by English wealth and began spending money as if the royal treasury were bottomless. Within his first year on the throne, James's expenditures had increased by over 300% compared to Elizabeth's final years. He threw lavish parties for his Scottish friends, commissioned expensive court entertainments, and began handing out pensions and gifts with reckless abandon. English taxpayers, who had grown accustomed to Elizabeth's relatively modest lifestyle, watched in growing alarm as their new king treated the royal treasury like his personal piggy bank. The religious implications of James's succession also created immediate controversy. While he was officially Protestant, his mother had been the Catholic Mary, Queen of Scots, and many English Catholics had hoped that James might be more tolerant of their faith than Elizabeth had been. When James initially seemed inclined toward religious moderation, Protestant extremists began to worry that their hard-won gains might be reversed. This religious uncertainty contributed to the Gunpowder Plot of 1605, when a group of Catholic conspirators attempted to blow up Parliament with James inside. The discovery of Guy Fawkes and his fellow plotters in the cellars beneath the House of Lords with barrels of gunpowder created a national trauma that would influence English politics for centuries. James's response to the Gunpowder Plot revealed both his political cunning and his fundamental misunderstanding of English sensibilities. While he successfully used the conspiracy to strengthen Protestant support for his regime, he also began to develop an almost pathological fear of assassination that would later manifest in increasingly paranoid behavior. More immediately shocking to English observers was James's apparent discomfort with the ceremonial aspects of kingship. Elizabeth had understood that monarchy was, in large part, a performance her subjects needed to see their queen as a figure of dignity, authority, and almost supernatural majesty. James, by contrast, seemed to view royal ceremonies as tedious obligations to be endured rather than opportunities to inspire loyalty and awe. Contemporary observers noted that James would often cut formal ceremonies short, ignore established protocols, and behave in ways that undermined the mystique of royal authority. During his coronation procession through London, he reportedly complained loudly about the crowds, the noise, and the length of the route, creating an impression of a king who viewed his subjects as an inconvenience rather than the source of his power. But perhaps most shocking of all was James's apparent lack of interest in military glory, the very foundation of royal authority in an age when personal courage in battle was considered the ultimate kingly virtue. Where Elizabeth had famously appeared before her troops at Tilbury in armor, declaring that she had the heart and stomach of a king, James seemed almost allergic to military matters. His physical cowardice became legendary at court. He wore heavily padded clothing for fear of assassination attempts, flinched visibly at loud noises, and reportedly once hid under a table when a courtier drew his sword too quickly during a demonstration. For a nation that had grown accustomed to viewing their monarch as the embodiment of English courage and martial virtue, James's obvious physical timidity was deeply unsettling. If James's Scottish entourage and crude manners had merely embarrassed the English court, his relationship with his male favorites created scandals that rocked the very foundations of royal authority. The story of James's passionate attachments to handsome young men would become one of the most controversial aspects of his reign, and would introduce a level of sexual gossip to the English court that would have been unthinkable during Elizabeth's virginal reign. The first and perhaps most significant of these relationships was with Robert Carr, a young Scottish page who caught the king's eye in 1607. Carr was everything that appealed to James: young, handsome, athletic, and completely dependent on royal favor for his position. Within months of their first meeting, James had elevated this minor courtier to unprecedented heights of power and influence. The transformation was breathtaking in its speed and scope. Carr, who had arrived at court as a virtual nobody, suddenly found himself showered with titles, lands, and responsibilities that would have been remarkable for a man of the highest noble birth. James created him Viscount Rochester, granted him vast estates, and most controversially, began to rely on him for political advice despite Carr's complete lack of experience in governance. But it wasn't just the rapid elevation that scandalized the court. It was the obvious intimacy between the king and his favorite. Contemporary observers noted that James would spend hours alone with Carr, that he would touch him affectionately in public, and that he would write him letters filled with endearments that were extraordinary even by the demonstrative standards of the age. In one surviving letter, James addressed Carr as "my sweet child and wife," language that shocked even courtiers accustomed to the flowery rhetoric of the period. The king's physical demonstrations of affection were equally startling. He would stroke Carr's face during public audiences, hold his hand during formal ceremonies, and embrace him with an intimacy that left no doubt about the nature of their relationship. The political implications were immediate and devastating. Foreign ambassadors reported back to their courts that the King of England appeared to be completely under the influence of a Scottish upstart with no qualifications beyond his physical attractiveness. English nobles who had served the crown faithfully for generations found themselves unable to gain the king's attention, while Carr could secure audiences, influence policy, and distribute royal favors at will. The scandal deepened when Carr became entangled in one of the most sensational murder cases of the era. In 1613, Carr married Frances Howard, the Countess of Essex, but their path to marriage had been paved with intrigue, adultery, and ultimately murder. Frances had been unhappily married to the Earl of Essex, but had begun an affair with Carr while still wed to her first husband. To clear the way for their marriage, Frances and Carr conspired to have her first marriage annulled on the grounds of the Earl of Essex's alleged impotence, a humiliating public examination that scandalized English society. But even more shocking was the revelation that they had murdered Sir Thomas Overbury, a close friend of Carr's who had opposed the marriage. Overbury had been imprisoned in the Tower of London on trumped-up charges, where Frances and Carr systematically poisoned him over several months. The murder was discovered when Overbury's jailer confessed on his deathbed, revealing a conspiracy that reached to the very heart of the royal court. The trial of the Earl and Countess of Somerset, as Carr and Frances had become, was a sensation that gripped the entire kingdom. Here was the king's most intimate favorite, a man who had been elevated from nothing to the highest ranks of nobility, revealed as a cold-blooded murderer who had used his royal connections to commit the perfect crime. James's handling of the scandal revealed both his political weakness and his emotional vulnerability. Despite overwhelming evidence of Carr's guilt, the king seemed reluctant to abandon his former favorite. He delayed the trial, attempted to limit the evidence that could be presented, and ultimately commuted Carr's death sentence to imprisonment, a mercy that many observers attributed to the king's lingering affection rather than any consideration of justice. But even as the Carr scandal was destroying James's reputation, the king was already becoming infatuated with a new favorite who would prove even more controversial than his predecessor. George Villiers was a young man of minor gentry background whose stunning good looks and athletic grace caught James's attention at a court ball in 1614. If the elevation of Robert Carr had been remarkable, the rise of George Villiers was nothing short of miraculous. Within a decade, this minor gentleman's son had been elevated to Duke of Buckingham, making him the first non-royal duke created in over a century. More significantly, Buckingham would become the most powerful man in England after the king himself, wielding influence that extended into every aspect of government policy. The relationship between James and Buckingham was even more openly intimate than the king's previous attachments. James called Buckingham his sweet child and wife, my sweet boy and dear venture, and signed his letters, your dear dad and husband. The sexual implications of this language were unmistakable, and the court buzzed with gossip about the exact nature of their relationship. But Buckingham was more than just a royal favorite. He was a political force who used his influence over the king to build a vast network of patronage and power. He controlled access to James, determined who received royal appointments, and effectively became a shadow king whose approval was necessary for any significant political advancement. the Duke's arrogance and ambition knew no bounds. He inserted his relatives into key positions throughout the government, demanded bribes for his influence, and treated English nobles with a contempt that would have been remarkable even in a man of royal blood. His rise represented everything that was wrong with James's approach to monarchy: the elevation of personal favorites over national interests, the corruption of traditional channels of authority, and the subordination of English interests to the whims of royal passion. Contemporary observers were shocked not just by the intimacy between James and his favorites, but by the king's apparent inability to separate his personal feelings from his royal duties. Where Elizabeth had maintained careful boundaries between her private emotions and her public responsibilities, James seemed incapable of such discipline. The result was a court culture unlike anything England had ever seen, one where political advancement depended more on physical attractiveness and the ability to amuse the king than on competence, experience, or loyalty to the realm. It was a system that corrupted everything it touched, and that would ultimately contribute to the constitutional crisis that would engulf James's son, Charles I. While James's personal scandals dominated court gossip, his political philosophy and catastrophic policy decisions were systematically undermining the very foundations of English government. The king, who had promised to bring unity and stability to his new realm, instead introduced ideas so radical and destructive that they would ultimately lead to civil war and his son's execution. At the heart of James's political thinking was his absolute belief in the divine right of kings, the theory that monarchs were appointed directly by God and were therefore answerable to no earthly authority. This wasn't merely an abstract philosophical position for James. It was a deeply held conviction that influenced every aspect of his governance and his relationship with Parliament. During Elizabeth's reign, the relationship between Crown and Parliament had been one of careful balance and mutual respect. Elizabeth understood that while she possessed significant royal prerogatives, Parliament controlled taxation and represented the interests of her subjects. She had navigated this relationship with consummate skill, using her intelligence, charm, and political instincts to maintain royal authority while respecting parliamentary traditions. James, by contrast, viewed Parliament as an inconvenient obstacle to his divinely ordained authority. In his mind, kings received their power directly from God, which meant that parliamentary attempts to limit royal authority were not just politically unwise but literally blasphemous. This fundamental misunderstanding of English political culture would create conflicts that grew more serious with each passing year. The first major clash came over taxation. James's extravagant spending habits had quickly exhausted the relatively healthy treasury that Elizabeth had left behind. His lavish gifts to Scottish favorites, expensive court entertainments, and general financial mismanagement created a fiscal crisis that required parliamentary intervention. But when Parliament attempted to tie new taxes to reforms in royal spending, James reacted with fury. In a speech to Parliament in 1610, James made his position devastatingly clear. The state of monarchy is the supremest thing upon earth, for kings are not only God's lieutenants upon earth and sit upon God's throne, but even by God himself they are called gods. This wasn't rhetorical flourish. James genuinely believed that questioning royal decisions was tantamount to questioning God himself. The practical implications of this philosophy were immediately apparent in James's approach to foreign policy, where his decisions would prove both personally embarrassing and nationally catastrophic. His most disastrous initiative was his attempt to arrange a marriage between his son Prince Charles and the Spanish Infanta, a scheme that revealed both his political naivety and his fundamental misunderstanding of English Protestant sentiment. The proposed Spanish match wasn't just diplomatically questionable. It was a direct insult to everything the English people believed about their national identity. For decades, Spain had been England's primary enemy, the Catholic power that had attempted to invade England and restore papal authority. The defeat of the Spanish Armada had become a foundational myth of English Protestantism, and the idea of welcoming Spanish royalty into the English royal family struck many subjects as a betrayal of their most sacred values. But James was convinced that a Spanish marriage would bring peace to Europe and enhance his own reputation as a peacemaking monarch. He ignored the advice of his most experienced counselors, dismissed the concerns of Parliament, and pursued the match with an obsession that bordered on the pathological. The negotiations dragged on for years, during which James made concession after concession to Spanish demands. He agreed to suspend the enforcement of anti-Catholic laws, promised to allow the Infanta to practice her religion openly, and even considered converting to Catholicism himself if it would facilitate the match. Each concession further alienated his Protestant subjects and strengthened the position of those who viewed him as either a secret Catholic or a weak king manipulated by foreign powers. The climax of this diplomatic disaster came in 1623 when Prince Charles and the Duke of Buckingham traveled incognito to Madrid to conclude the marriage negotiations personally. This romantic adventure, which James apparently viewed as a brilliant diplomatic stroke, was seen by his subjects as evidence that their king had completely lost touch with reality. The sight of the heir to the English throne essentially begging the Spanish court for a Catholic bride created a national scandal that damaged royal prestige irreparably. When Charles and Buckingham returned to England empty-handed after months of humiliating negotiations, James's foreign policy lay in ruins and his relationship with Parliament had deteriorated beyond repair. But perhaps James's most devastating political mistake was his treatment of Parliament itself. Where Elizabeth had understood that parliamentary support was essential for effective governance, James seemed to view every parliamentary session as a personal challenge to his authority. His speeches to Parliament were filled with lectures about divine right theory and complaints about parliamentary presumption. The king's attitude created a vicious cycle of mutual antagonism. Parliament, frustrated by James's refusal to consider their concerns, became increasingly assertive in demanding reforms. James, viewing parliamentary assertiveness as proof of their disloyalty, became even more rigid in defending his prerogatives. Each confrontation left both sides more entrenched in their positions and less willing to compromise. This deteriorating relationship had profound implications for English governance. Important legislation went unpassed because James refused to accept parliamentary conditions. Tax bills were rejected because Parliament demanded reforms that James considered violations of royal authority. The entire machinery of government began to break down as king and Parliament engaged in an escalating war of wills. James's religious policies added another layer of controversy to his already troubled reign. His attempts to promote religious unity through compromise satisfied no one and alienated everyone. Puritans viewed his tolerance of Catholic practices as evidence of his secret sympathies for Rome. Catholics saw his continued enforcement of discriminatory laws as proof that his promises of tolerance were worthless. The king's theological writings, which he published prolifically, revealed a monarch more interested in abstract religious speculation than in the practical challenges of governing a religiously divided kingdom. His treatises on divine right theory and his attempts to reconcile Protestant and Catholic theology struck many of his subjects as evidence that their king was more suited to be a university professor than a practical ruler. By the final years of James's reign, the political system that Elizabeth had managed so skillfully was approaching complete breakdown. Parliament and crown were locked in seemingly irreconcilable conflict. The royal treasury was empty despite increasingly desperate expedients. Foreign policy had collapsed into a series of humiliating failures, and the king himself seemed increasingly disconnected from the realities of governing his kingdom. The stage was being set for the constitutional crisis that would engulf his son Charles I and ultimately lead to civil war, regicide, and the temporary abolition of the monarchy itself. The scandalous successor who had shocked England with his personal behavior was also systematically destroying the political foundations that had made England one of Europe's most successful kingdoms. As James's reign progressed and his political failures mounted, the king's behavior became increasingly erratic and paranoid. The man who had survived the blood-soaked intrigues of the Scottish court began to see enemies everywhere, leading to one of the most bizarre and destructive obsessions of his reign. His fanatical belief in witchcraft and his determination to root out supernatural threats to his divinely ordained authority. James's fascination with witchcraft wasn't merely academic. It was deeply personal and rooted in his conviction that dark supernatural forces were actively working to destroy him. This obsession would lead to some of the most shameful episodes of his reign and would reveal the extent to which fear and paranoia had corrupted his judgment. The roots of James's witch mania could be traced back to his traumatic experiences in Scotland, where he had become convinced that a group of witches had attempted to kill him and his new bride, and of Denmark, through supernatural means. In 1590, severe storms had prevented Anne from traveling from Denmark to Scotland for their wedding. Rather than accepting this as natural misfortune, James became convinced that witches had raised the storms through demonic magic. The resulting witch trials were unprecedented in their scope and brutality. Under James's personal supervision, hundreds of suspected witches were tortured into confessing their supernatural crimes. The king himself attended many of the interrogations, personally questioning the accused and demanding increasingly elaborate confessions of demonic activity. The North Berwick witch trials, as they came to be known, revealed a side of James's character that shocked even his contemporaries. The same king who claimed to be too civilized for the crude violence of medieval warfare showed no qualms about personally supervising the torture of elderly women accused of practicing magic. He developed elaborate theories about demonic conspiracies and insisted that the witches had been working directly with the devil to overthrow his divinely appointed rule. James's expertise in demonology led him to write Demonology, a treatise on witchcraft that would become one of the most influential works on the subject in European history. The book revealed a mind obsessed with supernatural threats and convinced that witches posed a direct challenge to royal authority. In James's worldview, witchcraft wasn't just a crime against God. It was treason against the divinely appointed monarch. When James became King of England, he brought his witch obsession with him. One of his first acts was to pass a new Witchcraft Act that made the practice of magic punishable by death. The law was far more severe than the previous English legislation and reflected James's conviction that witchcraft represented an existential threat to royal authority. The English witch trials that followed James's accession were among the most brutal in European history. The king's personal involvement in promoting witch hunting created an atmosphere of paranoia and suspicion that tore communities apart. Neighbors denounced neighbors, servants accused masters, and families were destroyed by accusations of supernatural crime. But James's paranoia extended far beyond witchcraft. As his reign progressed and his failures mounted, he became increasingly convinced that his subjects were plotting against him. The Gunpowder Plot of 1605 had genuinely traumatized the king, confirming his worst fears about the loyalty of his subjects and the reality of threats to his life. The discovery of Guy Fawkes and his fellow conspirators in the cellars beneath Parliament with enough gunpowder to destroy the entire building had created a national crisis. But James's response revealed the extent of his paranoid tendencies. Rather than treating the plot as the work of a small group of extremists, James became convinced that it represented a vast Catholic conspiracy that extended throughout his kingdom. The interrogation of the gunpowder plotters became an obsession for James. He personally designed torture devices, specified interrogation techniques, and demanded confessions that would reveal the full extent of the supposed conspiracy. The king's involvement in the torture of the prisoners shocked even hardened court observers and revealed a ruler whose fear had overcome his better judgment. James's paranoia also manifested in his increasing reliance on a network of spies and informers who reported directly to him about potential threats. The royal court became a place of constant surveillance where careless words could be interpreted as treason and where courtiers learned to guard their tongues even in private conversations. The king's fear of assassination reached almost comical proportions. He wore heavily padded clothing to protect against knife attacks, insisted on tasting all his food for poison, and reportedly slept with loaded pistols beside his bed. His public appearances became increasingly rare as his fear of crowds grew stronger, and when he did appear in public, he was surrounded by unprecedented numbers of guards. This physical cowardice created a vicious cycle that further undermined royal authority. The more afraid James appeared, the more his subjects questioned his fitness to rule. The more they questioned his authority, the more paranoid and fearful he became. By the later years of his reign, the King of England had become a figure of ridicule rather than respect. Hiding in his palaces while his kingdom struggled with problems he seemed incapable of addressing. James's witch obsession also revealed the fundamental irrationality that had begun to characterize his thinking. Despite his extensive education and genuine intellectual abilities, the king seemed incapable of distinguishing between real threats and imaginary ones. His belief in supernatural conspiracies prevented him from focusing on the genuine political and economic challenges facing his kingdom. The decline in James's mental state became increasingly apparent to foreign observers, who reported back to their courts that the King of England appeared to be losing his grip on reality. Diplomatic meetings became exercises in managing a paranoid ruler who might suddenly change the subject to discuss demonic conspiracies or supernatural threats to his authority. Perhaps most tragically, James's paranoia prevented him from recognizing the real threats to his dynasty. While he was obsessing over witches and supernatural conspiracies, the genuine political forces that would ultimately destroy royal authority, parliamentary opposition, religious division, and fiscal crisis, were gathering strength unchecked. The king who had promised to bring unity and stability to England had instead created a reign characterized by fear, suspicion, and supernatural obsession. His subjects, who had expected a wise and capable successor to Elizabeth I, found themselves ruled by a man whose judgment had been corrupted by paranoia and whose fears had overwhelmed his ability to govern effectively. As James I's reign entered its final phase, the full extent of the damage he had inflicted on English monarchy became impossible to ignore. The king who had inherited one of Europe's most successful and respected kingdoms was leaving behind a legacy of scandal, dysfunction, and constitutional crisis that would ultimately destroy his dynasty and transform England forever. The most immediate and visible legacy of James's reign was the complete transformation of the English court's reputation. Where Elizabeth's court had been renowned throughout Europe for its sophistication, learning, and moral authority, James's court had become synonymous with corruption, sexual scandal, and financial excess. Foreign ambassadors who had once competed for the privilege of serving in London now viewed assignment to the English court as a form of diplomatic punishment. The stories that circulated throughout European capitals painted a picture of a kingdom in moral decline. Tales of the king's intimate relationships with his male favorites, his court's drunken revelries, and his abandonment of the dignity that had once characterized English monarchy created an international scandal that damaged England's reputation for generations. But the damage went far deeper than mere embarrassment. James's systematic destruction of the careful balance between crown and parliament that Elizabeth had maintained so skillfully had created constitutional problems that would prove impossible to resolve peacefully. His insistence on divine right theory and his refusal to acknowledge parliamentary authority had set precedents that his son Charles I would follow to their logical and catastrophic conclusion. The financial legacy was equally devastating. James's extravagant spending and his inability to work constructively with Parliament on taxation had left the English crown in a state of permanent fiscal crisis. The debts he accumulated and the financial expedients he employed to avoid parliamentary oversight created a situation where effective governance became impossible without radical reform. Perhaps most significantly, James's reign had fundamentally altered the relationship between the English people and their monarchy. Elizabeth had been genuinely beloved by her subjects, who saw her as the embodiment of English greatness and the guardian of their Protestant faith. James, by contrast, had become an object of ridicule and suspicion, a foreign king whose loyalty to English interests was constantly questioned. The transformation was visible in every aspect of public life. Where crowds had once gathered eagerly to see Elizabeth, James's public appearances were characterized by sullen silence or open hostility. Where Elizabeth's speeches had inspired national unity and purpose, James's lectures on divine right theory created resentment and opposition. Where Elizabeth had been seen as uniquely English despite her Tudor heritage, James was never allowed to forget his Scottish origins. The religious implications of James's reign were equally serious. His attempts to navigate between Protestant and Catholic expectations had satisfied no one and had created new sources of division within English society. His toleration of Catholic practices had alarmed Protestants without winning genuine Catholic loyalty. His theological writings had confused rather than clarified religious issues. His witch-hunting obsession had created an atmosphere of suspicion and fear that poisoned community relationships throughout the kingdom. The rise of the Duke of Buckingham had also created a new model of royal favoritism that would have devastating consequences for the future of English monarchy. The Duke's accumulation of power and wealth through royal favor rather than merit or noble birth had shown ambitious courtiers that personal charm and physical attractiveness could be more valuable than competence or loyalty to the realm. This corruption of traditional channels of authority had broader implications for English society. When advancement depended on the king's personal whims rather than established procedures, the entire system of governance became unpredictable and arbitrary. Nobles who had served the crown faithfully for generations found themselves displaced by upstart favorites. Professional administrators discovered that their expertise counted for less than their ability to amuse the king. The international consequences of James's failures were equally serious. His disastrous pursuit of the Spanish marriage had damaged England's relationships with Protestant allies throughout Europe. His reluctance to support Protestant causes in the 30 Years' War had created doubts about England's commitment to the broader Protestant cause. His diplomatic failures had isolated England at a time when European power relationships were being fundamentally restructured. The cumulative effect of these failures was to transform England from a rising European power into a kingdom struggling with internal divisions and external irrelevance. The nation that had defeated the Spanish Armada and had seemed poised to play a leading role in European affairs had become a cautionary tale about the dangers of incompetent leadership. But perhaps James's most tragic legacy was the way his failures would ultimately destroy his own family. The constitutional crisis that his policies had created would reach its climax during his son's reign, leading to civil war, regicide, and the temporary abolition of the monarchy itself. The divine right theories that James had promoted so enthusiastically would be literally put to the test when Charles I was executed as a traitor to his own people. The scandals that had characterized James's personal life would also have lasting consequences for royal authority. The British monarchy would never again be able to claim the kind of moral authority that Elizabeth had wielded so effectively. Future kings and queens would be viewed as fallible human beings rather than divinely appointed figures, and their personal conduct would be subject to constant scrutiny and criticism. In the end, James I's reign represented one of the most dramatic reversals of fortune in English history. The kingdom that had reached unprecedented heights under Elizabeth I had been systematically weakened by a king whose personal failings and political incompetence had created problems that would take generations to resolve. The contrast between Elizabeth's death and James's final years could not have been more stark. Where Elizabeth had died surrounded by the love and respect of her subjects, confident that she was leaving behind a stronger and more prosperous kingdom than she had inherited, James spent his final years increasingly isolated from his people, aware that his reign had been marked by scandal and failure. Yet even in his final months, James seemed incapable of learning from his mistakes. His continued obsession with the Duke of Buckingham, his persistent belief in his divine right to rule without parliamentary interference, and his refusal to acknowledge the damage his policies had caused all demonstrated that the king who had shocked England with his succession would shock them equally with his stubborn refusal to change course. When James finally died on March 27, 1625, there were few who mourned his passing. The kingdom that had once been the envy of Europe had been transformed into a cautionary tale about the dangers of incompetent leadership and personal scandal at the highest levels of government. The story of James I's reign is ultimately a story about the fragility of political institutions and the devastating consequences that can result when personal failings intersect with absolute power. The king who had promised to unite England and Scotland instead divided his subjects against their own monarchy. The ruler who claimed divine appointment instead demonstrated that kings could be as fallible, corrupt, and destructive as any other human beings. But James's story is also a reminder of how quickly political fortunes can change and how dramatically individual personalities can shape the course of history. Elizabeth I had created a model of successful monarchy that seemed unshakable, built on intelligence, dedication, and an almost supernatural understanding of her subjects' needs and expectations. James proved that all of these achievements could be undone by a single reign characterized by poor judgment, personal scandal, and fundamental misunderstanding of political reality. The scandals that defined James's reign, his intimate relationships with male favorites, his crude manners and inappropriate behavior, his obsession with witchcraft and supernatural threats, his financial excess and political incompetence, were not merely sources of entertainment for gossips and historians. They were symptoms of a deeper failure of leadership that would have consequences extending far beyond his own lifetime. The constitutional crisis that James's policies created would ultimately lead to the English Civil War, one of the most traumatic events in British history. The execution of his son Charles I would shock Europe and fundamentally alter conceptions of royal authority throughout the continent. The temporary abolition of the monarchy would demonstrate that even the most ancient institutions could be destroyed by persistent misgovernment. Yet perhaps the most lasting impact of James's scandalous reign was the way it changed English expectations of their monarchs. Never again would English subjects view their kings and queens with the kind of reverence and unquestioning loyalty that had characterized the medieval period. The divine right theories that James had promoted so enthusiastically would be permanently discredited by the failures of his own reign. Future British monarchs would be expected to earn their subjects' respect through competent governance and exemplary personal conduct. The scandals of James's court would serve as a permanent reminder of what could happen when royal authority was abused or when personal failings were allowed to corrupt public responsibilities. The transformation was visible in every aspect of British political culture. Parliament's role as a check on royal authority was permanently established by the conflicts of James's reign. The principle that kings must govern within the law rather than above it became a fundamental tenet of British constitutionalism. The idea that royal marriages and personal relationships should serve national rather than personal interests became an accepted part of monarchical duty. In many ways, the Britain that emerged from the constitutional crises triggered by James's reign was stronger and more resilient than the kingdom he had inherited from Elizabeth I. The checks and balances that developed in response to his failures created a more stable and responsive system of government. The parliamentary traditions that were strengthened by opposition to his policies would become models for democratic development throughout the world. But the human cost of these developments was enormous. The civil wars, religious conflicts, and political instability that resulted from James's scandalous reign would claim hundreds of thousands of lives and would create divisions in British society that persisted for centuries. The price of constitutional progress was paid in blood, treasure, and social trauma that could have been avoided if James had possessed the wisdom and restraint to govern more effectively. The story of James I serves as a timeless reminder that leadership matters, that personal character has public consequences, and that even the most powerful institutions can be damaged by persistent incompetence and scandal. It is a story that resonates across the centuries, offering lessons about power, responsibility, and the delicate relationship between rulers and the governed that remain relevant in any age. The scandalous successor who shocked England after Elizabeth I ultimately became more than just a failed king. He became a cautionary tale about the dangers of absolute power unchecked by wisdom, restraint, or genuine concern for the public good. His reign stands as permanent testimony to the truth that kingdoms rise and fall not just through external threats or economic forces, but through the character and competence of those entrusted with ultimate authority. In the end, James I's greatest scandal was not his personal relationships, his crude behavior, or even his political failures. It was his betrayal of the trust that his subjects had placed in him when they welcomed him as Elizabeth's successor. The kingdom that had reached unprecedented heights under the Virgin Queen deserved better than a king whose reign would be remembered primarily for the damage he inflicted on the institutions and traditions he had sworn to protect. The legacy of the scandalous king serves as an eternal reminder that with great power must come great responsibility, and that those who fail to meet this standard do so not only at their own peril, but at the cost of everyone who depends upon their leadership. James I's story is ultimately England's story, a tale of how quickly greatness can be squandered and how long it can take to repair the damage caused by scandal at the highest levels of power. Thank you for watching Silent Atrocities. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you want more absolutely insane, untold historical content that your teachers were too polite to mention, hit that subscribe button right now, like, share, and comment below. What other untold historical story would you like me to reveal? See you in the next one.